Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ask the Expert. I'm Zach Harold, Multimedia Specialist with the West Virginia University Extension Service Family Nutrition Program. And with me today, I have Gina Taylor. Hi, Gina.
Hi.
Can you tell us, just to start off, a little bit about who you are and what you do for Extension?
Sure. As you said, I'm Gina Taylor. I'm an extension agent in Jackson County for the Family and Community Development Unit, and I answer lots of canning questions every year.
How did you get into the canning question business? I know that's a big part of your job.
I have no idea, honestly. I I guess because one of the things I like to do in my job is mentoring, and so I work with a lot of different agents across the state. And when that happens, they will naturally call me when they have any kind of questions, and then that has rolled into Gina Taylor's the expert somehow.
Well, we're certainly glad to have your expertise here for this live video. You know, we've got all kinds of grow this participants around the state, and everything's coming into bloom all at once, and they're overrun with stuff, and folks are wondering what to do with all this. And I think canning is can be intimidating. It seems like to a lot of people. So glad to have
Yeah,
you here.
thank you.
Well, as you know, Gina, we went to our Facebook followers and asked them what canning questions they had for you. So let's go through some of them here. My friend Lauren McGill wants to know, how do you check your cans for safety? I've always been afraid of not doing it right and sickening my family, so I've avoided canning. So what would you have to say to Lauren?
I think that, Lauren, that's a common problem. A lot of people who haven't canned or who haven't canned in a while get a little bit nervous about making sure that they have the quality and the safety. That's very important, the safety especially. I would say that there's really no way, once you've done canning, once you've canned the product, there's no way to really eyeball it and tell. The only telltale signs you would have is if you see mold in the jar, or if you smell a, a bad smell that would indicate that there is spoilage. But unfortunately, when you're talking about something like botulism, it's very, it's impossible to tell, honestly. The only way that you can tell if you've got a good product is if you've done it right from the beginning. And I would recommend that if you are just starting out, that you call your local extension agent. And if they don't know the answer to your question, a lot of times they'll call me and I'll call you back. But you want to make sure that you do things right from the beginning. And that means using a reliable recipe that is approved by the USDA. Don't use your grandparents' recipes. I know that it's fun to go back and think about all the great times when you were growing up, but a lot of the recommendations changed back in the early 90s. And so we want to make sure that we stay current with any type of information that we're using to prevent making our family sick. So again, I would use a reliable recipe that comes from a reliable source and that's approved by the USDA, and also contact your extension office if you have any questions or if you need help. The other thing that I would recommend is that you find a canning book that it comes from a reliable source. If you use a canning book that comes from any of the canning manufacturers, such as Ball, the Ball Blue Book is a very good resource and it is very safe. We also use a book in extension called So Easy to Preserve. It comes from the University of Georgia, and we can help you. We can facilitate the ordering for you. We can help you with that. That is what we refer to as the canning Bible in extension, because it's got everything, not just canning, but freezing, drying, fermenting, pickling, making jellies and jams, and even storing your food.
Carol Motes has a question. Do vegetables need to be parboiled before packing to process?
No, Carol, they don't actually have to be. You can, there are two different ways that you can do your vegetables, or really pretty much anything that you can, any type of meat, vegetables, or fruits. You can do what is called a raw pack, which is you put raw food into the jar and then fill it to the proper headspace with boiling liquid, or you can pre-cook it, and there's great instructions in any type of good canning book. but you don't have to parboil anything in order to start off your canning. Now, one thing I will say is if you pre-cook the items that you're canning, you will be less likely to have a lot of space left over in the end. I tend to be a little lazy and I like to raw pack everything, but you really have to force the food into that jar to make sure it's packed very, very tight. Otherwise, you end up with, a lot of juice at the bottom and the food floating to the top.
Patricia Meadows wants to know: Can you can green? Can you can green tomatoes? Will they be mushy?
Yeah, you absolutely can green tomatoes. Now, as far as mushy, I don't really know. I've never canned them myself. They probably wouldn't be any mushier than just canning regular red tomatoes. You can actually can them just like a traditional red tomato, and you acidify them the same way. You process them the same amount of time on the same pressure, or if you're using a hot water bath canner, it's the same time period. And there are a lot of great recipes that you can use if you don't. I think a lot of people will can their green tomatoes because it's the end of the season. They still have a lot of these tomatoes left over, and they just want to do something so the tomatoes don't go to waste. At the National Center for Home Food Preservation, which is at the University of Georgia, they have a great website that you can use, and they have recipes for all kinds of green tomato dishes, such as relish, Piccadilly, and even green tomato pie filling. So if you really want to use those up, there's a lot of ways that you can do that.
That's interesting that you can use the same recipes, because you would think, I know there's always an issue when canning tomatoes about the acidity,
Yeah, and
but
there is a
it's the same
difference in
thing.
the acidity of green tomatoes versus red, but apparently the instructions are good enough to acidify the green ones too, so that's good. Not really. I mean, the scary part is if you have a tendency to wander off and forget things, like when I bake cookies, sometimes they end up being more like hockey pucks because I forget and I go off to do other things and I come back and they're just hard as a rock. But as far as canning, if you are just starting out, I would recommend that you start with a hot water bath canner, and because they're a lot less expensive than a pressure canner, and so you don't have quite the commitment level that you would if you bought a pressure canner. So that'll give you a little time to can a few things and try it out and see if you like it. In a boiling water bath canner, you can do fruits, and you can do tomatoes, and you can do jellies and jams. And so it's pretty versatile. You have a lot of options that you can use. If you want to can tomatoes, you can do those either in a hot water bath canner or a pressure canner. And so that's the beauty of the hot water bath canner, is if you have tons of tomatoes, especially, you could start out with the hot water bath canner and give it a try and see if you're actually committed and you want to continue doing that. And then if you decide you want to step up to vegetables such as green beans or anything like that, or meat, then you can invest in a pressure canner and you won't feel like you've wasted any money or anything. That's the way I would start out.
Keeping right along that line on canning tomatoes, Sarah Hewer, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that, wants advice about lemon juice versus citric acid when water bath canning tomato sauce, paste, or salsa. She says she has previously frozen sauce because she was nervous about the acidity in water bath canning, or how lemon juice might affect the taste. She said freezing salsa didn't work. The texture was disgusting, thawed. Her words, not mine. Should have thought that one through better, she says. Gaining the confidence to try canning it this year, I think. So, any advice there on lemon juice versus citric acid?
Absolutely. Sarah, the beauty of acidifying is you have three different choices. You can either use lemon juice, you can use citric acid, or you can use vinegar. Now, usually when I talk to people about it, I recommend that they don't use vinegar. And here's the reason. If you're using lemon juice, you'll use 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per quart. If you're using citric acid, it's a teaspoon per quart. But if you use vinegar, you have to use 4 tablespoons of vinegar, and that could feasibly affect how the food tastes. And so I usually recommend that people don't go the vinegar route, but stick to either lemon juice or citric acid. Now, there's really no advantage of one over the other. They're both very safe. If you buy citric acid, it comes in a small container that's about the size of a spice bottle, spice shaker. But again, you only use half a teaspoon per quart, and so you don't hardly have to use any at all. Lemon juice, I usually use if I've run out of citric acid and I'm still in the process of canning and don't want to run to the store. We did can some tomato juice this year, and I used lemon juice just because it's what I had in the house. So if you do choose to use vinegar, make sure it's 5% vinegar. The acidity is very important, and it'll say right on the bottle. But I would recommend you either go the lemon juice route or the citric acid. And again, one is not safer than the other, so either is fine.
Is there a taste difference between the lemon juice and the citric acid?
I I have never been able to tell that I've added lemon juice to anything. I mean, tomatoes are fairly acidic anyway, so adding just that little bit of acidity doesn't seem to make any difference. I guess the only thing would be is if you really have an aversion to citric, any kind of citrus like lemons or limes or anything like that, you might want to go with the citric acid because it's so little, it doesn't affect the taste at all.
Interesting. Is there, if you're dealing with, the lemon juice that comes in a lemon shaped bottle at the grocery store versus just slicing a lemon and juicing it yourself, does that make any difference at all?
Sure, there is a difference in the acidity, but the recommendations are actually for bottled lemon juice. So, don't feel like you have to go out and buy a bunch of lemons. For one thing, you're going to spend way more money buying lemons versus lemon juice. So I would just stick to the bottled variety.
Stick to the, well, probably the acidity is more uniform in
Yeah.
a, yeah. Interesting. Melissa Lamp wants to know, how does one tell if the new style of self-seal lids, no pre-boiling required, has sealed? To start off, can you explain what she means by the new style of self-seal lids? Maybe compare that to what maybe people used to be used to.
Yeah. Sure. Ball has now created a type of lid called SureTight. Okay. Now you need to make sure that you look on the box that has your lids in it to make sure that they either say or don't say SureTight, because the way that you're going to handle those lids is different. I guess the Ball company has done tons of research over the years on jars and lids, because they want to make sure that they're providing the safest product as well. The SureTight lids do not have to be put in hot water before you use them. That's the traditional lids. You did have to heat them up because it softened that rubber gasket that's on the inside of the lid and made it easier to seal. But the SureTight lids, you don't have to do that with. You might also find that you don't hear all the popping noise that you did with the traditional lids. A lot of people are complaining because that was, when you finish your canning, you like to hear the popping noise, okay? Because it makes you feel like, oh, yay, it's working. But the SureTight lids, you may have that and you may not. But the important thing about SureTight lids is you don't want to put them in hot water because that could actually end up causing them not to seal. So check your box and make sure if they say SureTight, wash them with warm soapy water, just like you would your regular lids, but don't put them in hot water. And I would also say, if you're using a traditional old style lid, which I assume eventually we won't have those anymore, but if you're using the old style lid, you don't want to boil those lids. You just want them to get up to a temperature so it does soften that rubber gasket. If you boil them, it could actually end up having the opposite effect.
Oh, wow. That's kind of depressing, though, to think that that very satisfying popping noise might become a thing of the past eventually.
It's kind of an iconic thing about canning, isn't it?
I always heard that, like, if it didn't pop, that means it didn't seal. Is that not? I mean, obviously, it's not true with the self or the Sure Seal lids, but is that even true of the older style?
Sometimes, you just don't hear them pop. Sometimes it'll take them hours to pop. Popping actually typically happens when the lid is sucking down to the jar. That's when the popping noise happens. But sometimes it takes a little while for that to happen. And, if you're like me and you wander off, then you may not hear it. It may have happened, but you didn't hear it. So, what I recommend is if you're, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead on a question, but somebody asked, how can you know if your lids have sealed? Um, you need to wait about 24 hours, 12 to 24 hours, but the longer the better. And then you can push the little button that's in the center of that flat part of the lid. And if it moves up and down and makes that kind of popping noise as you're pushing it, that means it has not sealed. You don't want to do that beforehand because you don't want to inadvertently push that down without letting nature take its course. And so you need to, once you take your jars out of your canner, let them sit for at least 12 hours. Don't put them in boxes and put them on the shelf or anything. Just let them rest. And while they're resting, that is when that process will happen.
I'm just throwing in extra questions. Nobody necessarily wrote these on. Store with the rings on or off?
Off. It's kind of, it makes me a little nervous. I only started taking the rings off a few years ago because that's what I read was the recommendation, but it always made me a little nervous. But if they're sealed, they're sealed. Okay. And nothing short of you dropping the jar or opening it is going to keep that seal from sticking. The reason you should take those rings off is because they rust a lot easier than the other part does. And so you could potentially get rust in that ring that could unseal the jar. So it's better if you go ahead and take the rings off and store them in a nice, cool, dry place so that they don't rust. And that way you'll be able to use them over and over. Now, you obviously cannot use the flat part again. Once you've used it one time, that's the part you throw away. But you can reuse those rings, as long as they are not rusty. And as long as they've retained their shape, then you could keep on using those and it'll be just fine.
Joyce Mace Somerville asks, is it safe to can in an electric pressure cooker that has canning features?
No, it's actually not. I know that the manufacturers do advertise their product in a way that would make you believe that it's safe to can in them. However, again, the University of Georgia has done extensive research on those devices, and they have found that they are not safe to can in. And the primary reason is because the inside of the product, the middle of the jar, which is the hardest to heat and keep warm and all that stuff, it does not get to a proper temperature to kill bacteria. And so it's very important that if you're going to can anything, you can in a canner. Don't use the electric cooker and it's the same with any type of pressure cooker, even one that you put on the stove. They're not meant to be canners. Okay. If you're going to can, use a canner. Now you can use a pressure canner as a cooker if you like, but you can't go the opposite direction. So my phrase for you is can in a canner and nothing else.
Just spend the extra money and get the pressure canner, and then you can do everything you want.
Exactly. And you can use your other electric canner or not electric canner. You can use your electric pressure cooker to cook in. That's what it's designed for, and that's what it's safe for.
That's a little scary that, there's kind of some misleading advertising. It sounds like people could get seriously sick making that mistake.
Yeah, and actually, the lady that did a webinar for us, who works at the University of Georgia, contacted the manufacturer to find out the methods that they used to do their testing and do their research on canning in their product. And they said that the research was flawed, and so they recommend that we don't ever tell people to can in those pressure cookers.
That is definitely good to know. Next question is from Debbie Tanner Hennon. And she says, I've seen different opinions on canning sausage. My grandma just cooked the sausage completely, put the balls in the jar with some grease, turn them upside down to seal. Is this a safe method?
Okay, well, we started out with your grandmother always did it this way. Okay, well, I always tell people, our grandparents didn't ride around with seatbelts in their cars. A lot of times they either didn't get a car that had them or they cut them out. And I remember as a child riding in between the two seats that my parents were sitting in. And, we would never dream of doing that now. When we know better, we should do better. And we have seatbelts and we have pressure canners. And so, no, we definitely would never, ever allow any type of any product we're canning to just sit on the counter and seal on their own. And I'll tell you why. A bacteria called Clostridium botulinum, which leads to botulism, the sickness that you get from food, from improperly canned food. It only becomes active once your jar has sealed. So if you let it seal on the countertop, that just opens up the door for the Clostridium botulinum to start poisoning your food. It's very, very important that you don't ever, ever do that. They call that the open kettle method. And it's something we don't ever recommend. And we really try to dissuade people from doing that. So the only way that you can kill the bacteria Clostridium botulinum is by getting your water up to 240 degrees. Now, if you're canning in a hot water bath canner, the water can only get to the boiling point, which is 212 degrees. That is not hot enough to kill this bacteria. That's why we why we always tell people never to can their green beans in a hot water bath canner. I know it's a very popular thing. People say, well, I just can them for 4 extra hours. Okay. Well, for one thing, why would you want to spend 4 extra hours canning green beans when you could do them in a pressure canner and it doesn't take that long? It doesn't take 4 hours, I can tell you that. But the pressure canner can get the water up to 240 degrees. And that's the point that you need for any meat and any vegetables in order to kill that bacteria. Just please keep in mind that you don't want to make your family sick. You don't want to make anyone else sick. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a lady in Ohio who had canned her potatoes in a hot water bath canner. And as you know, potatoes are very starchy. They're a vegetable. They should be done in a pressure canner. So at some point, she took those potatoes and made potato salad for a church picnic. And her potato salad ended up killing one person in her congregation and hospitalizing several others. That is something you never want to happen. You don't want to be in the headline of the paper saying that you killed somebody because you didn't want to spend the time to can your food properly. So please don't ever can your sausage by just letting it sit on the counter. Put it in the pressure canner and follow the recommendations. And that way this goes back to what I was saying before. The only way that you know that your food is safe is that you've done it properly the first time. And so it's very important to follow the directions. Call your extension agent, get a reliable canning book, and just follow those directions. Don't risk it.
It sounds like there were canning practices that were fairly commonplace in years past, but like as knowledge about the science of how all this thing works, we've had to update those procedures, right?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the most common practices that I've heard about in my years in extension, I've been in extension for about 20 years, but I've only been working with family and community development, so the canning type of thing, for about 15 years. But one of the most common practices that I have heard about since being in this job is canning over an open fire. And the reason that people give is that they can can 70 quarts of green beans at one time. Okay, well, you're canning 70 quarts of poison if you're doing that. Because the other thing that these jars need is not just a high temperature, but a consistent temperature. And if you've ever tried to cook a hot dog or a marshmallow in a fire, the fire goes up and the fire goes down and the fire goes up and the fire goes down, and you put more wood on it and the fire goes up. So there's no way of knowing what temperature you're actually getting by putting your canned goods over an open fire. So I also don't recommend that you do that.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, and it seems obvious when you think about it, but I'd never thought about the reason a pressure canner is used for certain things over a water bath canner. Even if no matter what kind of fire you're using, the water is never going to get above a boiling point in
Right,
normal.
right, exactly.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So always use a pressure canner when it comes to stuff like that. And if people do want to can meat, that's one of those pressure can only things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I can't say enough in favor of canning meat. It's one thing, I think a lot of people are afraid to use a pressure canner because they probably were raised a lot like I was. And when our parents were pressure canning, they would yell, "Get out of the kitchen, we're using the pressure canner." Because, people have experienced problems with pressure canners. I think primarily because they don't pay attention and they don't keep up with watching the temperature, making sure that it's not, the pressure isn't getting too high. There is a limit of the pressure that can happen in a canner, and you need to make sure that you keep your temperature adjusted and you keep checking it to make sure that it's not getting too high. I've heard stories about people, their doors have exploded in the canner and then everything in the canner shot out of that steam port. And so their whole kitchen was covered with spaghetti sauce or whatever they were making. And, that is a risk. But if you keep up with it and you pay attention, then you shouldn't have any problems like that. The other thing that you should do every year is bring your pressure canner into the extension office and let your extension agent test it to make sure that the pressure that is on the dial is actually the correct pressure. Now, we don't test the weighted gauges, the ones where you put the combination weight on the top, but the ones that have the dial with the numbers, those are the ones we test. We have a testing kit and it has a master gauge on it. And so what we do is we pump up the pressure on your lid and we measure it to see if it has the same weight, the pounds per inch, as our master gauge does. Now, if it's not the same and it's 1 or 2 pounds higher or lower than the master gauge, we just give you a recommendation of how you can adjust your recipes. Now, if it's 3 pounds higher or lower, then we recommend that you just get a new gauge. You don't have to get a new canner. So if you buy one at a yard sale or you inherit your great-grandmother's canner, whatever you do, don't get rid of that, because they don't make them as high quality as they did back then. And so you want to make sure you hold on to those. And for heaven's sake, if you ever see one at a yard sale for $10, buy it, because that's pretty cheap. They're getting to the point where they're pretty expensive. But all you have to do is you have to unscrew that gauge from the top of the lid and get your new one, screw it back on. And I would also recommend that if you buy a new one, have it tested as well, because you never know if there's going to be a manufacturer's error. One lady brought in a gauge to have me test, and it was very off. And so, and you don't even have to bring the whole canner. You can either bring the lid, or if you want to unscrew the gauge, you can just bring the gauge in, and we can test any of those ways.
That's very interesting. You need to do that once a year, you said.
Mm-hmm.
Just to ensure that the pressure you're seeing on that gauge is accurate and you're not going to blow it up.
Yeah, because if you over process your food because the gauge is measuring lower than it actually is and your pressure is really high, then your product is going to be a lot lower quality. But if it's not measuring, if it's measuring higher than it is, then you have too low pressure, then that's when you're compromising your safety. So it's very important to have those tested.
Moving on to our next question, Lori Norris Bizer says, has anyone tried canning with all-in-one lids? Is that different than the Selfseal lids we were talking about just a minute ago?
Yeah. And those all-in-one lids are kind of gaining notoriety, I would say. They're, I guess people see them as a shortcut. But those are not, we don't ever recommend using those for canning. And the reason for that is the two-piece canning lid design is how you get the food without any air in it at all. And that's what the preserving is about, is removing the air from the jar. And so if you put your jar in the canner and you're using that one-piece lid, there's no way for the air to escape from the jar. And so one of actually a couple things could happen. You could end up with air in the jar, which will facilitate the growth of bacteria, which you don't want because it could make you sick. The other thing is you could blow out the bottoms of your jars because the air doesn't have any place to go. So it's very important that you don't use those lids. Those lids are used for commercially canned foods. So when they're canned actually at a, canning facility, a cannery, where you get your jars in the store, you buy your spaghetti sauce or you buy your canned whatever. But they are not recommended for home canning because we don't have the type of equipment that would actually allow those lids to release the air and be safe. So yeah, give those up. Now those are very handy once you open your jar and you want to just put a lid on it to put it in the fridge if you have some left over. They're great for that, but they're not good for home canning.
So I'm not much of a canner, but my wife is into it, and she keeps me abreast about the goings on of the canning community online. And she told me about something here not too long ago, not something she was interested in trying for the record, but just something she found kind of strange. Was that people are, I guess, canning flour, like all-purpose flour that you make cakes and cookies with. Is that safe? Why are they doing this?
Honestly, I don't know why they're doing it, but people are not just doing it with flour, but they're doing it with rice and beans and different other dried goods. I guess they think they're adding a layer of safety to storage. I think people are also trying to make sure, I don't know if you tried to buy anything like pinto beans a few months ago when this all started up, but I mean, it was very hard to find anything that you could stretch for a long time. And so I think people started to think maybe I could can this and then I could keep it a lot longer. But it's called dry canning and it's a thing, but it should not be a thing. Okay. So people are putting all these products in a jar and then they're putting it in the oven and heating it up to some arbitrary temperature that they think is safe. But the problem is even those dry items have moisture in them. Okay, there's no way to get something completely dry. It is a dry product, but it still has some moisture. And so what you're accomplishing by putting it in the oven is you're taking that moisture that's already in the food and you're heating it up, and then you're basically opening the door for bacteria because bacteria grows in warm environments. And so I've been hearing a lot about dry canning. Dry canning's not a thing. Don't do it. You're not actually benefiting yourself at all. You would be better off just to put the food in a jar, put the lid on it, and just set it in your counter. That would be much safer than trying to, introduce heat to it. Another thing you can do is if you have one of those food saver systems that has the jar attachment, those are actually pretty good. You can put rice or beans or whatever in a jar, a flour, and if you put that attachment on, it will suck the air out. So then you have an airless environment, which is much preferable to heating it up. So don't do the dry canning method. It's really not safe.
All right, we'll go here to our final question here, and we'll let you go. Tamla Ellswick wants to know, she says, I canned corn, and this morning the water doesn't cover the corn in the jar. Is it still safe or edible?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's still safe if you properly canned it in the first place, which, of course, if you're doing corn, has to be done in a pressure canner. But it's not uncommon to lose some of your liquid in any type of thing that you can. And that's okay. As long as you don't lose more than half of it, it should be fine. Now, I will tell you that anything above that liquid is going to look bad, especially something like corn. It's going to turn brown at the top, but it's not going to be unsafe. It's just going to be kind of unsavory. That's the kind of thing that you want to cook it before your kids see that in the jar because they're going to say, I'm not eating that. But yeah, it should be fine. Now, some of the ways that your jars can lose liquid like that is if your heat is too high. I recently experienced this phenomenon when I was canning peaches and I lost all kinds of liquid and I couldn't figure out why. I have a new stove And I didn't realize that the eye that my canner was on was a super eye. And so it has a lot more gas that comes out of it. And so, I mean, it's extremely hot. And so what happened was it forced not just the air, but a lot of that liquid out too. And so I had to just start all over with those peaches. And the other reason, there's a lot of reasons, but another common reason is if you put your lids on too tight, that can cause loss of liquid too. What we tell people is finger tight only. And I don't know if you can see this, but if you put your fingers like this on the top of the lid and only use your fingers, don't use your wrist, just use your fingers. That's as tight as it has to be. It does not have to be on there super tight. It just needs to be finger tight. And that gives the good balance of your lid being able to lift up during the processing, letting the air out and so forth. But for some reason, tightening up too much will cause your food to lose a lot more liquid.
Good to know. So if folks are watching this and they have more questions, as I'm sure they will, what's the best way to get in touch with somebody from Extension? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Well, you can look on the Extension website and you'll see a listing of all the county offices. I believe the tab even says county offices, and that will give you a contact phone number for all the offices in your state. You can call any of those offices. It's typically better if you call the one in your county, especially if you want to get your canner tested. That way you kind of build a relationship with the agent in the office. And during these times where we're trying to restrict visitors, we will let you make an appointment to have your canner tested. I've already tested 3 just in the last month, and I've had them come to the door, set their canner down, go back to their vehicle. I take it in and test it, and then I give them their sheets that have the results of the testing, and I put it back out and signal them to come and get it. And then, you know, I'll wear a mask, and so I can talk to them at the door and say, if you have any more questions, if you don't understand my recommendations, please call me back, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it. And I've had a lot of people call me this summer. I've really enjoyed it. That's one of my favorite things in Extension is working one-on-one with people to help them solve their problems.
You know, we've definitely seen through the Grow This program a huge uptick in interest in home gardening. Have you seen that as far as canning is concerned as well? Are more people getting into it?
Yes. If you've ever tried to buy a canning jar during the last 2 months, you can forget it. I was trying to buy lids one day, and I saw one of our clients in Kroger, and I said, "Oh, cross your fingers. I'm here for canning jars." And she said, "Forget it. There are no canning lids." Oh, I was in there for lids. She said, "There are no lids here." She said, "There were 2 packs at Walmart yesterday, but I doubt they're there today." So we ended up having to go to the Amish country and shop in a couple of stores that are typically only Amish clientele. You know, we called Lehman's, which is a very, very popular store for everybody up there. And they said, "No, sorry." And so we found a couple of little stores that are mostly Amish clientele, and they had jars and lids because, you know, the Amish can all the time. There's not an uptick for them. I mean, they're staying at the same levels. But with the additional gardening has come additional canning because people have spent a lot of time on their gardens and they know they can't possibly eat it all. And so a lot of people are starting canning from the beginning for the first time, or they've picked up canning where they haven't done it for years. And we saw this same type of surge after the derecho came through West Virginia because people had all these freezers full of food. They got spoiled, or they had to eat really, really fast with all their neighbors. And so I think the lesson learned from that was you can't always rely on electricity. You can't always rely on your freezer to be there full of your foods. And, you know, canning kind of fixes that problem because all you need once you've finished your canning is a cool, dry place for your jars to sit. And so I think a lot of people have kind of picked up canning from that, and then also from all these amazing gardens that everybody's planting. And, you know, I have to admit to you, I planted a ridiculously large garden this year, and I've already picked tomatoes like 10 times, and it's like they won't go away. And so I got in on the frenzy too, and then had to go buy my jars someplace else.
Well, that's a good bonus tip. Head to the Amish country.
That's right.
All right. Well, Gina, that's all I've got for you. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us about this. We really, really appreciate your expertise.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it. And, just remember, you can always call your extension office to get some good answers, some reliable information, and the safest way of doing things. So don't forget us. Give us a call.
All right. We'll do. I'm sure we'll have folks take you up on that. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day.
All right. You too. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you.